Have you ever judged someone at first glance, only to realize later that you were completely wrong? A waitress did exactly that. She mocked an old man, not knowing he was actually the owner of the very place she worked at. But the real twist is yet to come. You won't want to miss this story. Dear listeners, please subscribe my channel to hit 1,000 figure. It was a regular evening at an upscale restaurant in Carmel, California. The place buzzed with the chatter of wealthy diners, the clinking of glasses, and the soft hum of classical music playing in the background. The restaurant was known for its exclusivity. Only the elite dined here. Among the waitress staff was Sophie, a young woman in her mid-20s. Bright, opinionated, and outspoken about her beliefs, she prided herself on her sharp wit and strong opinions. She often engaged in conversations with customers, sometimes even sharing her unfiltered thoughts about politics and Hollywood. That evening, as she walked past one of the tables near the corner, she noticed an old man sitting alone, dressed simply in a button-down shirt and jeans. He didn't look flashy or important. Just another diner, probably someone who had wandered in. Sophie wasn't impressed. In fact, something about him made her assume he wasn't the typical high-class guest. As she approached, she couldn't help but comment half-jokingly, "You know, this place is usually reserved for people who actually belong here." She smirked slightly, as if expecting him to feel out of place. The man looked up at her with calm, piercing eyes. He didn't react, didn't show anger. Instead, he just smiled. A small, knowing smile. What Sophie didn't realize was that she had just mocked the owner of the very restaurant she worked in. Sophie didn't think much of her comment. To her, the man in front of her was just another diner. Someone who probably didn't fit the usual profile of the restaurant's elite guests. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, he wasn't surrounded by security or assistants, and he certainly wasn't flashing a Rolex like some of the high-rolling customers she had served before. Still, she could sense that something about him was different. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, carried an air of quiet confidence. But instead of being offended by her remark, he simply chuckled softly and leaned back in his chair. "Oh," he said in a calm voice. "And what kind of people belong here?" Sophie, always quick with a response, smirked. "Well, you know, Hollywood elites, business moguls, high-profile figures, people who actually make things happen." The man nodded, still unfazed. He took a sip of his drink before casually replying, "Interesting. And who do you think I am?" Sophie shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe a retired farmer or some small-town guy who saved up for a fancy dinner." She laughed lightly, glancing around as if expecting others to join in on her joke. A few tables away, another waiter overheard the conversation. His eyes widened in horror as he recognized the man sitting before Sophie. Before he could intervene, the man simply smiled again and said, "I guess you could say I've saved up for a few things in my time." At that moment, the restaurant manager happened to walk by. He stopped in his tracks, noticing Sophie standing over the guest. His face paled instantly, and in an urgent whisper he said, "Sophie, can I speak with you for a moment?" Confused, Sophie nodded and stepped aside. The moment they were out of earshot, the manager's face turned serious. "Do you have any idea who you just spoke to like that?" Sophie frowned. "No, just some old guy who—" The manager cut her off, his voice low but firm. "That old guy is Clint Eastwood. He owns this restaurant." Sophie's heart nearly stopped. Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? The Hollywood legend? She felt a sudden rush of embarrassment wash over her. Her stomach twisted into knots as she turned back toward the table. Eastwood was still there, still calm, still watching her with the same patient gaze. She had mocked one of the most legendary actors and filmmakers in history. And, worse, she had insulted the man who signed her paycheck. Sophie's face turned pale as the weight of her mistake settled in. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands felt clammy. She had just mocked Clint Eastwood, a man whose name carried legendary status in Hollywood, a man whose films had shaped generations, and, most importantly, the owner of the very restaurant she worked in. She turned back toward the table, swallowing hard. Eastwood was still there, calm as ever, sipping his drink. He hadn't yelled, hadn't scolded her, hadn't even shown a hint of offense. That, somehow, made Sophie even more nervous. If he had been angry, she would have at least known what to expect. Gathering her courage, she slowly walked back to the table and cleared her throat. "Mr. Eastwood, I didn't realize. I'm so sorry." Eastwood simply looked up at her with that same unreadable expression. Then, with a slight smirk, he said, "Why?" "Because you just found out who I am?" Sophie froze. The words hit harder than she expected. It was true. Would she have apologized if he had been just another customer? Would she have treated him with the same respect if she hadn't learned his name? She fumbled for words. "No, I mean, I shouldn't have assumed. I didn't mean to be rude." Eastwood chuckled. "I've been in this town longer than you've been alive, kid. I've seen people judge others based on what they wear, how they look, or what they do for a living. But you know the funny thing? The richest people I've ever met never felt the need to prove anything to anyone." Sophie's face burned with embarrassment. She had spent years forming opinions about people, thinking she could read them at a glance. Yet, here was a man who had built an empire, won Oscars, directed some of the greatest films of all time, and he carried himself with more humility than half the restaurant's elite guests. She looked down, struggling to find the right thing to say. "I really am sorry, sir." Eastwood smiled and leaned forward slightly. "Apology accepted, but let me give you a little advice." He pointed around the restaurant. "In life, you never know who you're talking to. So, treat everyone with the same respect, whether they look like they own the place or not." Sophie nodded quickly. "I understand." Eastwood picked up his napkin and wiped his hands. "Good. Now, how about that steak I ordered?" The tension broke. Sophie let out a nervous laugh, nodded, and hurried away to put in his order. But deep down, she knew. This was a moment she would never forget. Little did she realize this night would change her perspective forever. As Sophie hurried to place Clint Eastwood's order, her mind raced. She had walked into work that evening with confidence, believing she could judge people by their appearance. But now she realized just how wrong she had been. She had misjudged one of the most respected men in Hollywood, not just as an actor and director, but as a person. He had every reason to be offended, to call out her rudeness, maybe even fire her on the spot. But he didn't. Instead, he taught her something invaluable: humility, respect, and the power of perception. While Eastwood calmly enjoyed his meal, Sophie couldn't help but steal glances at him from across the restaurant. He blended in effortlessly, chatting with a few staff members, treating everyone around him like equals. He wasn't demanding special treatment. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply was Clint Eastwood, powerful without needing to show it. A private conversation with the legend. Later that evening, as things slowed down, Sophie nervously approached his table once more. "Mr. Eastwood, can I ask you something?" He looked up, still as calm and composed as ever. "Go ahead." She hesitated for a second, then asked, "Have you ever been judged unfairly, like I did to you tonight?" Eastwood leaned back in his chair, a small smirk playing on his lips. "More times than I can count." Sophie furrowed her brow. "But you're Clint Eastwood. How could anyone underestimate you?" Eastwood chuckled. "Before I was Clint Eastwood, I was just some kid trying to make it. I've been the underdog. I've been turned down. I've been told I wasn't good enough. I've worked jobs where no one took me seriously." He paused, tapping his fingers on the table. "The trick is to never let other people's judgments define you, and never make the mistake of thinking you know someone just by looking at them." Sophie absorbed every word. "I guess I learned that lesson the hard way tonight." Eastwood gave a slow nod. "Well, at least you learned it." He placed a generous tip on the table, stood up, and adjusted his jacket. "Keep that in mind, and you'll do just fine, kid." And with that, he walked out of the restaurant, the same way he had entered, humbly, without needing anyone's approval. The impact of that night, Sophie never forgot that night. It changed how she saw the world, how she treated people, and how she carried herself in life. She learned that respect isn't about status, wealth, or power. It's about character. And every time she saw Clint Eastwood's name on a movie poster or heard his voice in an interview, she didn't just see a Hollywood legend. She saw the man who taught her one of the most valuable lessons of her life.